Well, switching tracks to international news now, and the Yellow Vest movement has taken a violent turn once again. One person was killed today as France witnessed the sixth Saturday of nationwide protests. A 36-year-old man was killed in southern France when his car hit a truck at a roundabout blocked by protesters, bringing the total number of dead in the protests to 10. Anti-fuel tax protesters have blocked trucks at the borders and national highways. However, the movement is far from over. Despite losing its support base, only 800 people gathered in Paris, marking one of the lowest turnout in the protests. Protesters have also vowed to march, however, to the historic Palace of Versailles, which has been closed over riot fears. Earlier, the demonstrations forced President Emmanuel Macron to announce a nationwide debate over taxation that would take place in the next 3 months or so. Negotiations to end the protests have failed, and the French president's approval ratings plunged to a record low as the movement progressed. The government announced the cancellation of a fuel tax hike set for January 2019 and also announced a cut in diesel rates. And joining us to talk a little bit more about what's happening in France is Dr. David Lee, who is the lecturer at French Studies in the University of Warwick. And Dr. David Lee, thanks very much for talking to us this evening. Your thoughts of how this has panned out for the French president, 6 straight weeks of protest, despite the fact that now they have decreased, the number of people protesting has decreased, but certainly this has been the first question mark on the presidency of the French president.
Yes, this has been a real challenge for Emmanuel Macron, and I think he's still really coming to terms with his opposition to his presidency. Really, this began, as you said, over taxes on fuel in particular, and taxes in general in France, and it's really escalated since then. I think it's, as you say, the numbers of protesters are decreasing, but that's not to suggest that there is some opposition to Macron still on the streets, and indeed across France as a whole. So the very fact that we're talking again about these protests in the 6th week demonstrates a real challenge for Macron, and nothing that he's done so far seems to address these major concerns of the French people.
Right, and as you pointed out, of course, that the protests have spanned from different communities of people. So it's not just students or just those affected by the fuel hike, but then policemen, and it's sort of escalated since then. It's also, of course, we are seeing that the French president is seeing some of his lowest ratings since he became the president. Now, the French president worldwide seems to be a popular figure, but back home, the sense now is that he's seen as bourgeois, he's seen as somebody who's not popular with the blue-collared workers.
Yes, I'd very much agree with that sentiment. I think it's somebody who is on the international stage, is very popular, as you say, who has dealt very widely with world leaders. I think partly because of his economic reforms and his environmental proposals, but at home, as you say, seems to be really disconnected with the ordinary people. When he was first elected, he came in saying he would be like Jupiter, that he would be above the ordinary everyday political fray. And yet, really, he has to kind of come down from that level and actually talk to ordinary people. This is one of his major challenges in terms of his presidency, has been failing to really talk to people on the streets and go out and address major concerns. He seems to be very aloof and very removed from ordinary people. So it's something which I think he's working on in terms of his communication strategy. But it's interesting that his prime minister is often the person sent out to actually address ordinary people's concerns rather than Macron himself. Macron generally doesn't actually address the people very often. And so this is something he needs to work on looking into the new year.
Right, and that's also the fact remained that the Prime Minister was the one who actually said that we made some mistakes in understanding the sentiment of the people of France. But David Lee, I'd like to ask you now, there have been a series of concessions, of course, that the French president has made, which increases, of course, include tax-free overtime and freeze on gas and electricity prices, also concessions to the police force. But what would this certainly mean for the budget in France? Now, these concessions have come very quickly. It also shows how badly the French government has been able to handle the situation, merely pushing concessions rather than actually opening up the discussion with these different sections of people.
That's absolutely correct. Yes, I think it's a real issue because essentially what Macron has promised to do now, as you say, is to provide overtime tax-free, to increase the minimum wage, to increase the tax threshold for the personal allowance equivalent of income tax. All these things will have a significant impact on France's balance sheets. This is also at a time when Macron was elected with a very clear mandate of making France more competitive overseas, making France more competitive in terms of the economy as a whole. So essentially those two things don't go together. They're actually quite contradictory in terms. So I would argue really that Macron's major challenge now is looking out and seeing, well, hang on, I've made these concessions. What more do people really want from me? Because part of the issue here is the very fact that Macron has made these concessions in the first place. It suggests to some extent that this could be a real issue, because the temptation now for the French people is to take to the streets again in the future and see what else they can get from this president. So it's a real issue, really. And I think he's not solved the situation by making those concessions in the first place. In some ways, he's probably made a situation worse. And I think that's a major challenge for Macron, as I say, looking ahead to January. And there's a series of elections in France over the next few years, which will be a real test for Macron electorally.